When is the crime? Is it when the first punch is thrown, when the first body hits the floor, or when the last person realizes they're not leaving alive? Because on one humid Florida night, 5 adults walked into a house angry, confident, and very much alive. By morning, every single one of them was dead. No witnesses, survivors, emergency call, and not a single clear answer as to who started what would become one of the most disturbing personal violence cases Florida investigators had ever seen. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. This was a fight. And it ended with silence. Florida never truly sleeps. Even in the quietest neighborhoods, there's always something. Insects buzzing, palm trees shifting in the breeze, the distant hum of traffic bleeding through the night. That's why what happened on August 14th, in a gated community just outside Fort Myers, went unnoticed for so long. At 11:47 p.m., 3 neighbors would later tell police they heard raised voices. Not screaming, not panic, just arguing. 2 men, then a woman's voice, sharp, controlled, authoritative. And then nothing. No crash, no gunshot, no alarm. Just silence. And in Florida, silence is strange. House 117 sat at the end of a curved street lined with trimmed hedges and identical driveways. Middle class. Clean. Safe. The kind of neighborhood where nothing violent was ever supposed to happen. Inside that house, 5 adults had gathered for what everyone believed would be a conversation. It was not supposed to be dangerous, that IT was not supposed to be physical, and it was never supposed to end in death. But something went wrong. Very wrong. The story does not begin with violence. It begins with frustration. Daniel Cross, 41, was a contractor. Known locally. Not flashy, but dependable, at least he used to be. Over the past year, his business had been failing. Projects delayed, payments missed, and one particular debt had turned into a ticking time bomb. $38,000. That was how much he owed Marcus Hale, 38, a former military serviceman who had gone into a joint business venture with Daniel that collapsed almost as quickly as it started. At first, Marcus was patient. Text messages recovered later showed polite reminders, then firmer demands, then warnings. I don't want problems, but I need what's mine. We should talk face to face. Daniel ignored most of them until Marcus showed up at his house. Marcus did not come alone. With him was his sister, Lena Hale, 35, known among friends as protective, outspoken, and unwilling to back down once she believed someone had crossed her family. Daniel's wife, Rachel Cross, 39, was already home. Friends described her as calm, diplomatic, the kind of person who stepped between arguments before they turned ugly. And then there was Evan Miller, 42. Evan was a mutual friend, a bridge between both men. He had insisted on being there, just to make sure nobody does anything stupid. 5 adults. 1 living room. That a conversation loaded with months of resentment. Neighbors would later say they saw shadows moving back and forth across the front window. People pacing, arms gesturing, someone standing too close. The air inside House 117 grew thick. Words became accusations. Accusations became insults. And then something changed. Investigators believe there was a moment, small, almost invisible, when the situation tipped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was likely something simple. A shove, that a step forward that wasn't invited, that a sentence that went too far. Because once that moment happened, the fight stopped being verbal. And when the fight became physical, everything unraveled faster than anyone could stop it. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the outcome. It's the lack of sound. There was no gunshot to alert the neighborhood, no crash loud enough to trigger concern, no scream that carried past the walls. This was close-quarters violence. Personal, messy, quiet enough to remain hidden. At 11:58 p.m., less than 11 minutes after voices were first heard, the house fell completely silent. Lights went out. Phones were either dropped or destroyed. And 5 people lay dying or already dead inside a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. The next morning, nothing seemed wrong. Sunlight spilled across manicured lawns. Sprinklers clicked on. A delivery truck passed by. No one noticed that House 117 hadn't moved. It wasn't until 9:07 a.m. that a neighbor noticed something off. A car still parked awkwardly in the driveway, doors unlocked, curtains unmoved. Police arrived at 9:12 a.m. What they found would haunt them for years. 5 bodies, that no survivors, that no clear sequence, that no obvious starting point. And the most troubling realization of all, this wasn't one person snapping. This was a fight that escalated, shifted, and consumed everyone inside. Someone struck first. Someone fought back. And at some point, someone decided that if they were not leaving that house alive, no one else would either. By the time investigators asked the most important question, when is the crime? There was no one left to answer it. And that is what makes the Florida fight so terrifying. Not the blood, not the bodies, but the fact that it began the same way so many arguments do, with people who believed they were still in control. By the time anyone realized the conversation inside House 117 had failed, there was no polite way out. Arguments don't usually announce when they're about to turn dangerous. They don't come with warning sirens or clear lines in the sand. Most of the time, they shift quietly. One sentence spoken with the wrong tone, one step taken too close, one refusal to back down. Inside that living room, all 5 adults believed they were still talking. They weren't. The seating arrangement alone told investigators everything. Daniel Cross had positioned himself near the kitchen entrance, his territory, his house, his rules. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Marcus Hale stood near the center of the room, arms crossed, calm on the outside, but witnesses later described him as someone who carried tension in stillness. Lena Hale paced. Rachel Cross stayed close to Daniel, but not touching him, already anticipating the need to step in. Evan Miller stood near the hallway that led to the back door. That placement would become tragically important. Text messages recovered from Marcus's phone suggested he had one goal: resolution. Not reconciliation. Resolution. I'm not leaving until we settle this. That sentence, spoken or implied, changed the atmosphere. Daniel heard it as a threat. Rachel heard it as a warning. Lena heard it as confirmation that her brother had been pushed too far. Evan heard it and immediately knew this was going in the wrong direction. He tried to de-escalate. Let's slow this down. But when emotions reach a certain temperature, reason becomes background noise. Investigators believe the argument turned personal when Daniel accused Marcus of trying to ruin his family. That accusation struck something deep. Marcus had kept his voice level up to that point. But at that moment, witnesses believe his tone changed. Not louder, colder. That's when Lena stepped in. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply said something along the lines of, "You don't get to play victim here." Those words landed hard, and Daniel responded physically. No one knows exactly what the first physical act was. That uncertainty is the core of the case. But forensic evidence suggests a sudden movement near the coffee table. Something knocked over, something heavy displaced. A lamp, not a decorative object, something solid. Daniel's hands showed no defensive wounds. That tells investigators he wasn't expecting what happened next. And whatever happened next changed the dynamic instantly. The moment the first blow landed, everything accelerated. Rachel moved toward the center of the room, trying to put herself between the men. Evan backed toward the hallway. Marcus reacted, not emotionally, instinctively. Years of training don't disappear under stress, they surface. And once Marcus engaged, the fight stopped being a shove or a scuffle. It became a struggle for dominance. But this was not a one-on-one fight. This was 5 people in a confined space, all reacting at once. Lena moved toward Daniel. Rachel grabbed Lena. Someone fell. Something cracked. And then came the sound no one heard outside the house. A body hitting the floor. Hard. Daniel Cross was the first to go down. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. That detail is crucial. Because while Daniel lay injured, still breathing, the fight did not stop. It evolved. Investigators later noted something chilling about the blood patterns. There was movement, not panic-driven chaos, movement with intent. People repositioning, someone attempting to stand, someone blocking a path. Evan Miller's footprints told a story of hesitation. He didn't immediately run. At first, he stayed. Then something changed his mind. Evan had come to mediate. He had no stake in the debt, no emotional history, no reason to fight. But once Daniel went down, Evan understood something the others didn't. This was no longer about money. This was about control. And control, once contested, becomes dangerous. At some point, Evan moved toward the back hallway. Not running, walking quickly, measured, trying not to draw attention. But someone noticed. And that's when the fight fractured into multiple fronts. Marcus had injuries on his forearms, defensive wounds consistent with blocking strikes. Lena showed signs of intense struggle, neck trauma suggesting close-range violence. Rachel's injuries were inconsistent, some defensive, some from behind, which means she was attacked while trying to protect someone else, or while trying to stop someone, or both. This was not a sudden massacre. It was a chain reaction, one action forcing another, fear amplifying aggression, survival instincts overriding relationships. The most unsettling detail came from the kitchen. A drawer had been opened, then closed. No knife was missing, but the act itself mattered. Someone considered escalation. Someone thought about crossing a point of no return. And once that thought enters the room, it changes everything. By now, Daniel was no longer a participant. He was a liability. An injured man on the floor becomes a problem no one knows how to solve. Help him and risk retaliation. Leave him and accept consequences. Silence him and cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. Investigators believe that decision point happened right then. The violence intensified. Close range, hands, weight, pressure. No gun, no distance, just bodies and fear. Evan ran, not fast enough. His body would later be found near the back door. His injuries suggest he was attacked from behind. That tells investigators two things. He had turned his back, and someone did not want witnesses. By 11:58 p.m., the house was quiet again. But this silence was different. This was the silence that comes after everyone understands the same horrifying truth. No one is calling the police. No one is leaving. And whatever happens next will finish this. The most terrifying moment in violent confrontations isn't the explosion. It's the pause. That brief, unnatural silence when everyone realizes the situation has gone too far, but not far enough to stop. Inside House 117, that pause happened after Evan Miller went down. Not dead, but not moving. And for the first time since the argument began, no one was shouting. The autopsy reports would later reveal something chilling. The injuries did not happen all at once. They came in stages, which means there was time. Time to stop, time to run, time to call for help. But no one did. Daniel Cross was still alive at this point. Barely. His breathing was shallow, labored. His head injury severe, but not immediately fatal. He lay near the living room, where the argument had begun, now reduced to nothing more than a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. Marcus Hale stood over him, blood on his hands. Not from rage, from contact. Marcus's heart rate, according to forensic estimates, would have been high, but controlled. Training doesn't eliminate fear. It organizes it. Lena Hale was no longer pacing. She was still, watching. Rachel Cross hovered near Daniel, torn between instinct and terror. Everything in her wanted to help her husband. But she had seen the shift in the room. She understood, before anyone else did, that compassion was now dangerous. And somewhere near the back of the house, Evan lay silent. This is where the story becomes unbearable. Because from this moment on, the violence was no longer accidental. It was decisional. Investigators believed Marcus was the first to understand the implications. If Daniel survived, the police would come. If Evan survived, there would be a witness. If Rachel survived, there would be a story that could not be controlled. The fight had created something irreversible. And irreversible situations demand choices. There is evidence that Marcus tried to speak, not yell. Speak. A hand raised. A word or two. But Lena interrupted him. Not with violence. With certainty. She understood something her brother was still grappling with. No one leaves. The blood patterns on the floor suggest Rachel moved toward Daniel again. She knelt. She tried to lift him. That action sealed her fate. Because the moment she touched him, she became part of the outcome. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. But those 2 minutes destroyed 5 lives. Lena moved first. Her injuries suggest she engaged at close range, aggressive, direct, unrelenting. Rachel fought back. She had no training, no plan, only desperation. Her defensive wounds tell the story of someone trying to shield another person while being attacked. Marcus hesitated, and that hesitation cost him. Marcus's rib fractures and forearm lacerations indicate he was struck while attempting to intervene, not escalate. That matters, because it shows that even in the middle of chaos, he was still trying to stop the bleeding, figuratively and literally. But once blood is spilled, stopping becomes harder than continuing. Daniel died during this phase, not instantly. His cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma complicated by asphyxiation. That phrasing tells investigators something crucial. Pressure was applied, deliberately, not wildly. At this point, there were 3 people left alive, and one of them understood exactly what was happening. Marcus turned on Lena, not in rage, in resolve. He realized, too late, that the situation had escaped him, that this was no longer about debt or pride. This was about containment, and Lena would not stop. The struggle between siblings was brief but brutal. Lena's neck injuries indicate close contact, hands, forearms, leverage. No weapon, no distance, just force. Marcus survived the encounter, but something inside him broke. Because once Lena fell, the room became very quiet again, and Marcus stood alone with the consequences. Rachel was still alive, barely. Her injuries suggest she tried to crawl toward the hallway, toward the door Evan never reached. Marcus followed, not fast, not frantic, slow, deliberate. He didn't want a chase. He wanted an ending. Rachel's final injuries indicate she was struck from behind. That matters, because it means she never saw it coming, which means Marcus had made his decision. Now there was one survivor, and a house full of evidence. Marcus did not try to run. That's one of the most unsettling details of the entire case. He didn't flee the state. He didn't destroy the house. He didn't attempt to stage a break-in. Instead, he sat, breathing, waiting, thinking. Forensic evidence suggests Marcus remained in the house for several minutes after the last death. He washed his hands, then stopped. He sat down, and that's where investigators believe he finally understood something no training had prepared him for. He couldn't undo this, and he couldn't explain it. Marcus Hale died last. Cause of death: self-inflicted trauma. Time of death estimated between 12:06 a.m. and 12:09 a.m. That means the entire incident, from raised voices to 5 deaths, lasted less than 25 minutes. When police entered House 117 the next morning, they were not met with chaos. They were met with order. Bodies where they fell. No forced entry. No clear villain. Just the aftermath of a fight that escalated beyond control. And that's why investigators struggled with the question: when is the crime? Was it when Daniel shoved? When Lena struck? When Marcus decided no one could leave? Or was the crime committed the moment all 5 people chose to stay instead of walking away? Because by the time anyone realized what the fight had become, there was no one left to tell the story. When detectives stepped into House 117 at 9:12 a.m., the first thing they noticed wasn't the bodies. It was the stillness. No television playing in the background, that no phone vibrating, that no signs of panic frozen in motion. Just a house that looked paused. That's what unsettled them. Violent scenes are usually loud even after the fact. Overturned furniture, shattered objects, chaos in every corner. But this house felt organized, contained, almost respectful, as if the violence had followed rules. The front door was unlocked. No signs of forced entry, which immediately told investigators something crucial. Everyone inside had chosen to be there. The living room was where it started. A lamp lay broken near the coffee table. Not shattered, displaced. Knocked with force, but not thrown wildly. That detail suggested close proximity, not rage-filled destruction. Blood patterns on the rug showed direction, movement. Not a single explosion of violence, but multiple moments. People standing, falling, being dragged, repositioned. Someone had tried to clean a section of the floor. Not thoroughly, just enough to smear the truth. That attempt would later haunt the case. Daniel Cross's body was found near the center of the living room. He lay on his side, one arm curled beneath him, eyes partially open. His injuries told a complicated story. Blunt trauma, pressure injuries, and signs he had been alive longer than investigators initially assumed. That mattered, because it meant others had time to act while he was still breathing. Time that no one used to save him. Rachel Cross was found near the hallway. Her position suggested movement. Crawling, reaching. Her injuries were defensive. Hands raised, forearms bruised, fingers fractured. She had fought to live, and she had lost. Lena Hale's body lay closer to the kitchen. Her injuries were severe and intimate. Neck trauma consistent with sustained force. No hesitation. No accident. Someone had held on until it was over. Investigators wrote a single word in their notes beside her name. Intentional. Evan Miller was found near the back door. His shoes were still on. His body angled toward the exit. One hand outstretched. That detail broke seasoned officers, because it meant Evan had believed escape was possible. For at least a moment, Marcus Hale was found last, seated, back against the wall, legs bent, head lowered, not sprawled, not hidden, placed. His death was ruled self-inflicted. But even that conclusion brought more questions than answers. Phones were recovered, all damaged, some shattered, others submerged briefly in water. Not long enough to erase everything, just long enough to delay. Text messages stopped abruptly, calls unsent. One phone had a draft message that was never completed. Just 2 words. This is. Nothing else. No murder weapon was ever conclusively identified. That alone made the case a nightmare. Multiple injuries, multiple causes, no single object responsible. Hands, pressure, force, human bodies used as weapons. Investigators mapped the blood spatter, angles, heights, directions, and slowly a horrifying picture emerged. This wasn't chaos. It was progression. The house told story, but not a complete one. There were gaps, moments where something clearly happened but left no trace. A decision made, a conversation spoken softly, a look exchanged. Those things don't show up in forensic reports, but they shape outcomes. The medical examiner's timeline introduced the most disturbing revelation of all. The deaths did not occur in quick succession. There were pauses, minutes, long enough for someone to realize what was happening. Long enough to stop. That fact haunted the investigation, because it meant the final outcome wasn't inevitable. It was chosen. Neighbors were interviewed. No one had heard screams. No one had heard calls for help. Only raised voices. Then silence, which meant the violence had been controlled, contained, not explosive enough to spill into the night. The community struggled to understand. This doesn't happen here. That phrase echoed in every interview. But the truth was simpler and darker. This didn't start as violence. It started as a conversation. The case was reviewed again and again. Different detectives, different theories. Was Marcus trying to protect? Did Lena escalate? Did Rachel intervene at the wrong moment? Was Evan simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Every version ended the same way. 5 dead. No witnesses. No definitive sequence. 9 months later, The case was officially closed. Not solved. Closed. Cause of death, homicide, manner, undetermined sequence of events. A rare designation, a quiet admission that the truth had died with the people inside that house. But some investigators weren't satisfied. One detective, nearing retirement, would later say off record, "That house kept something from us, because there was one detail they could never explain. The front door had been unlocked from the inside," which raised a question no report could answer. At some point, someone could have left and chose not to. Cases usually end with answers. An arrest, a confession, a motive neatly explained in court. This one didn't. It ended with 5 names typed into a report and a silence no one could explain. 9 months after the deaths inside House 117, the case file was officially stamped closed. Not solved. Closed. The difference matters. Because closed means there would be no trial, no verdict, no final narrative to explain who crossed the line first. Just a summary. 5 adults entered a house alive. 5 adults died inside. No one left. The final report was careful with its language. Altercation escalated. Multiple contributing factors. Sequence undetermined. Those phrases are what investigators use when the truth is too complex or too uncomfortable to put into plain words. Because how do you explain a fight where everyone lost? The medical examiner's conclusion was equally restrained. Each death was listed separately, as if they were unrelated events that happened to share the same address. But the injuries told a different story. They were connected. Every wound linked to another action. Every death dependent on the one before it. A chain reaction that began with something small and ended in obliteration. Friends and family searched for meaning. Daniel Cross's relatives focused on the debt. If Marcus hadn't pushed him. Marcus Hale's family focused on the pressure. If Daniel had just paid what he owed. Rachel Cross's friends believed she had been trying to save everyone. She was the peacekeeper. Evan Miller's family struggled the most. He didn't even belong there. And Lena Hale? Those who knew her said the same thing over and over. She would never back down. 5 perspectives. 5 truths. None complete. The house was cleaned, repainted, sold. New people moved in. They changed the furniture, the curtains, the locks. But some neighbors swear the house never felt the same. Not haunted, just heavy, like something unresolved still sat in the walls. One detective kept the case photos long after retirement, not because he thought he'd solve it, but because it reminded him of something important. Violence doesn't usually start violent, he said. It starts with people who think they're still in control. That's the part that scares professionals the most. Not criminals, not predators, but ordinary people, tired, frustrated, proud, pushed into a moment where walking away feels like losing. Because in House 117, no one wanted to lose. And that's why everyone did. The question that still lingers isn't who killed whom. It's when the crime actually began. Was it when Daniel ignored the messages? When Marcus demanded a face-to-face meeting? When Lena stepped into the argument? When Rachel chose to stay instead of calling for help? When Evan didn't leave the moment voices were raised? Or was the crime committed earlier than all of that? At the moment each person decided, I'll just stay a little longer. Because the truth is, there were exits. Before the first blow. Before the first fall. Before the first death. And once those exits were ignored, the house closed in on itself. That's why this case still circulates quietly among Florida investigators. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as a warning that some crimes don't have villains, only choices. And once enough bad choices stack on top of each other, there is no single person to blame. 5 people entered that house believing the night would end with answers. Instead, it ended with questions that can never be answered, and one final truth that no report could fully capture. The crime didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments. Moments where someone could have stopped, and didn't. So when people ask, when is the crime? This case offers no comfort, only this chilling answer. The crime is not when the police arrive, not when the bodies are found, not even when the first blow lands. The crime begins when everyone realizes the situation is dangerous and stays anyway. Because in Florida, on a quiet night when no one screamed loud enough to be heard, a fight became a tragedy, and silence became the final witness.